Welcome to the What Works and Why podcast with me, your host, Prasid Jagannathan. In this episode, we speak with Rory Sutherland, the vice chairman of Ogilvy and Mather Group, one of the most renowned advertising agencies in the world. Rory is an advertising legend, having spent over 4 decades at Ogilvy and almost 2 decades as vice chairman. Rory started the Behavioral Insights team and spends his days applying behavioral economics and evolutionary psychology to solve problems that traditional advertising agencies haven't been able to solve. Rory is the best selling author of Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense, and writer for the Spectator's WikiMan column. Rory is erudite, observant, thoughtful, and absolutely hilarious. His 4 decades of experience in the persuasion business is only an add on. As usual, the guests or I may own securities discussed in the podcast. All opinions expressed in the podcast are for informational and entertainment purposes only and must not be construed as investment advice. I hope you have as much fun as I did speaking to Rory.
Particularly, I'm now recording. Yeah.
Great. Great.
I can also give you permission to record, I think, but I'm not sure. But I can send. Don't worry. I can send you the recordings anyway.
Great.
So no
thank
problem.
Right. So I'll just get started.
Of course.
So, Rory, welcome to the podcast. Incredible honor speaking with you. I read Alchemy thrice. The first time a couple of years back when Patrick O'Shaughnessy recommended it on his podcast. The second time recently in anticipation of our conversation. And the third time simply because, and the third time simply because of how hilarious and entertaining the book was. The humor elicits a strange familiarity with you and the content. Were you always this funny?
To be honest, I think behavioral science and consumer psychology and consumer insight, when done well, is, if you like, a sub-branch of humor, because it's a different take on the world. Fun enough, I haven't read it yet. I got an email today from, I think, some sort of evolutionary psychology center on the evolutionary value of humor.
Right.
And we need much wider discussions about this. There's a very, very interesting academic in London who makes the case that people who are neurodiverse, whether it be autism, probably dyslexia, in fact, all of these things in many ways impose a burden on the person who carries them, particularly in a society which demands sort of literacy, numeracy, etc. And yet the very neurodiversity that gives rise to these notional disabilities is valuable to society as a whole. And her theory is that just as in a beehive, as I've mentioned, some of the bees follow instructions and some of the bees go off at a tangent. And it's called the explore-exploit trade-off, that you need bees that exploit the knowledge you already have and which conform to pre-existing assumptions about what's optimal. But you also need bees who go and discover what's different, what's new. And you'll notice, by the way, among successful entrepreneurs, whether it's, these aren't always positive role models, but if you included Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Henry Ford and Colonel Sanders and Steve Jobs, and Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and so on, all of them, I think, are characterized, for good and ill, with a very unusual decision-making style. In other words, they process the world fundamentally differently. And I'd also add a humor, actually, a sense of humor I would bracket with those other qualities, which is it's something of huge value to society. That value we don't fully understand, but simply the ability to actually look at something different, look at something backwards, see the same thing as everybody else, but come to a completely different conclusion, have a perverse take on an issue which is diametrically different to that of everybody else. And also to do it in a way where other people can accept it, which is, I think, what makes humor special. In other words, you can actually correct someone without necessarily diminishing their status or sense of identity with a well-placed joke. And I think in any social human setting, that quality is pretty necessary. It's a very interesting question to ask. How would a completely humorless tribe get on? I mean, one of the things that fascinated me about this is having children. I kind of naively assumed before I had kids that, because I can't really remember being 2 years old, okay, myself. And I can remember finding things funny when I was 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, and I increasingly got into comedy and loved comedy when I was kind of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. What I didn't realize until I had children is the sense of humor, okay, in a slightly childish form. I'm not suggesting that, there's witty repartee from 2-year-olds, but their appreciation of things that are funny comes very, very early in childhood development. I mean, my own kids, you could tell them a joke and make them laugh practically when they were babies, when they were unable to speak. You'd play some silly little game where you'd appear and then disappear and hide and then reappear. And you could make them laugh at an incredibly early age, which was incredibly gratifying, but also it was kind of enlightening to me because I hadn't realized how innate that instinct, it's kind of on the motherboard, humor,
Absolutely,
I think.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, especially a response to a certain silly, wacky behavior in kids. Maybe that comes on really early on. Have you studied comedy, by the way? Have you studied comedians?
Yeah, we've had a wonderful guy on Nudgestock who's actually at the University of Colorado, I think, in Denver, who is one of the world's leading humor researchers. He has a particular theory, which is its kind of benign violation. In other words, it allows you to break a rule without the normal consequences. Okay. In other words, perhaps it allows you to contradict someone or correct a collective delusion. And by creating an emotional reward in the form of laughter or just general amusement, it effectively perhaps breaks a dangerous cycle. There is a story I heard, by the way, from a friend of mine in South Africa, which kind of fascinates me, which is there was some sort of road rage incident in Johannesburg. And this guy gets out of his car. He's furious with the guy who's cut him up. And he basically opens the trunk of his car and takes out a baseball bat and heads over to the other guy. The other guy then goes to the trunk of his car and brings out a machete, at which point the other guy goes back with a handgun, okay, fetches a handgun, and then the other guy goes back to his trunk and kind of brings out some, AK-47 or something of the kind, okay? Now, as you can see, this is rapidly escalating, okay? And you wouldn't expect it to end well, but at the point where the other guy brings out a huge gun, they both burst out laughing and get back in their cars and drive off.
Okay.
Because something about the humorousness of the situation has allowed them to break a cycle. And there's a danger, if you think about it, in a world in which we were too rational, you would occasionally get these very dangerous positive feedback loops, which would escalate to the point of absurdity. And what humor would do is it would allow you to actually exit this, on-ramp to disaster at a suitably early phase before what you might call your pursuit of iterative thinking had driven you to an insane outcome or ridiculous consequences. So there's something there going on, by the way, which is I think we should cultivate it. We certainly shouldn't persecute humor or mischief because it's innate and it patently serves some purpose. In the same way that it's very rare to find a society without a religion historically. And in the same way, I suspect that there is another theory, which is it's just a spandrel, that it's what in evolutionary terms is just a byproduct of something else, which doesn't serve any particular purpose, but which we find enjoyable. I don't know. I mean, the point you'd make is that why is it in particular that we need an emotional reward for finding something funny in the form of laughter? Well, nature patently makes orgasms fairly enjoyable. for the purpose of encouraging us to reproduce. And if you consider a laugh as a kind of miniature orgasm in the mind, okay, maybe it's there for the same reason. It's to encourage habits of thought and to incentivize habits of thought, which, particularly in a human social setting, how much do we laugh on our own? We can laugh on our own. We can sit and watch television, although then we're not entirely on our own. We can read books and laugh on our own. But certainly in a social setting, it seems to me fairly likely that in certain situations, humour performs a really, really valuable role. And the fact that we have an incentive both to deliver it, you could just argue it's a kind of form of reciprocal generosity. That when you share a joke, you find it enjoyable to tell and the other people find it enjoyable to listen to. So it's a way of kind of creating value in a positive sum game. I mean, it could just create social cohesion that way. But
yeah,
maybe it works in multiple ways. You know, in evolved settings, in evolved psychology, not everything has to have a single function. It simply has to be beneficial overall.
do you think funny people are better placed in an AI world? Do you think they are more likely to survive the onslaught?
Odd. It's certainly true that if you can be funny, you have a talent that one probably so far proves you're human, or at least is a fairly strong indicator that you're human. And secondly, it does seem to be a talent that AI finds particularly hard to replicate. Now, having said that, I haven't spent ages with ChatGPT basically bullying it to be funnier and funnier. But it is worth noting that we haven't yet, because I think we would have heard about if AI had come up with a really good original joke, right? Now, you know, most of us, you know, in terms of original jokes, we can come up with routines, we can come up with, you know, satire, sarcasm. There are a lot of what you might call high context uses of language, which we as humans can employ, saying the opposite of what we mean, understatement, exaggeration, all those things.
Yeah.
Now, it is interesting that probably humor tends to be quite high context. And it's an interesting question, which is whether AI will always find this difficult to replicate. My suspicion is not. Whether it can actually come up with a joke, I don't know. I mean, I've asked it to write things in the style of P.G. Wodehouse. And I'm pretty sure that's culturally relevant. Is P.G. Wodehouse still big in India, by the way? Because I'd heard
Yes,
that
absolutely.
extraordinary.
Absolutely. I was actually going to ask you that because there's a certain resemblance to Woodhouse in your writing and a Woodhouseian humor, if you can call it that. And I wanted to ask you about Woodhouse and his influence on you.
But funny about that. Funny enough, I worked in direct marketing with someone who is his, I think, great niece, who was called Claire Woodhouse, and she was a very, very good person in marketing, actually, who was, I think, let me get this right. Her father must have been Woodhouse's nephew. I don't think she ever met him, but I think her father knew him. I mean, being funny in prose like that is bloody difficult. I mean, I can manage it sometimes, being honest about it. Being as I mean, the person who was a great student of Woodhouse was Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and that series of books. And I know that Douglas Adams used to go and sort of read Woodhouse, and he'd take a paragraph and almost pick it to pieces to find out what made it so funny. And I think in the process, he kind of realized that you only had to change the order of two words or get one particular bit of phrasing slightly wrong, and it lost most of its humor. And that business of the absolute precision required to be funny in prose compared to being funny on stage, for example, is really, really interesting. It's very interesting that comedians actually, if you read some of the works of Stuart Lee, the comedian, he will, when he has a set, he will continually tweak words and pieces of word order. And of course, you do get then feedback from the audience in terms of how funny they find it. And he also kind of works out for himself, which is better. But he'll tweak little phrases endlessly until he gets them just right. And I mean, I think I'm delighted to hear Woodhouse is still big in India, because
Absolutely.
it's also very good, as well as being funny. It's very good prose writing as well. I mean,
Yeah,
his
it is.
it's worth reading some of his serious. He wrote sort of schoolboy stories which weren't really comedic, but it's worth noting they're incredibly well written. The other person I really admire, not so much as a humorist, but just as a prose writer, and I always thought I was a bit childish admiring this, but Kingsley Amis, the novelist, said the same thing. Conan Doyle, the Sherlock
Okay.
Holmes author,
Sherlock
is
Holmes.
given that he was writing in the late 19th century and early 20th century, I guess.
Hmm.
You find you can read all his works. Quite a lot of 19th century stuff is pretty painful to read,
Hmm.
but you can read his stuff, and you pretty much never have to double back to work out who's speaking, to work out what a sentence means, in terms of absolute clarity of writing, while still maintaining quite a lot of subtlety. That
Hmm.
he's another person I admire, but Woodhouse is kind of slightly a class
Classic.
apart.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Hmm. As in, I mean, speaking of Woodhouse, right, that there's a certain distinct observational style to his comedy.
yeah.
You read him and then you think that he's a great observer of happenings. You read Darwin, you think he's a great observer, almost meditational to his surroundings. In intellectual circles, do you think there is an overemphasis on reading and knowledge gathering,
Well,
versus observation and
Well,
experimentation?
it's funny you say this, because I was having this discussion with a mathematician friend of mine the other day. I said, what we really prize in science is like your ability to prove stuff. Okay, you know, p p values. The person who's famous is the person who proves stuff,
Hmm.
who subjects it to Popperian falsifiability and so on, or who comes up with a theory. Okay, maybe it's the person who comes up with a theory. But before those people came up with a theory or an insight, they noticed something. And you go back and they noticed something, and they noticed the significance of that something,
Hmm.
even if the thing they noticed was of itself trivial. And this is
Hmm.
where it comes back to Sherlock Holmes, and his assertion that the outliers and oddities in detective work are more likely to be your friend than your enemy. In other words, it's the unexpected little small detail that helps you solve the case. And it occurred to me that in penicillin, in smallpox vaccination, in Viagra, okay, in an awful lot, supposedly in the invention of the steam engine, with Watt noticing a boiling kettle, Newton with gravity, okay, all of those things started, and for that matter, Archimedes in the bath, right? All
Yeah.
those things started with someone noticing something.
Hmm.
And it was either ooh, that's strange, or I've never thought of this like that before. And in the case of Darwin, it's supreme observation, going around looking at the beaks of finches on different islands in the
Yeah.
Galapagos. Okay, I mean, it's worth noticing he got lucky, because he and Russell Wallace both got to travel around the world and look at both geology and botany in a way that was denied to 99.9% of, I suppose sailors could have done it, I guess.
Yeah.
But it was denied to most people. But it was all noticing shit. Now, one of
Hmm.
the points I'm trying to make is that, really, if we want more scientific progress, maybe we don't need more scientists. We need more people with remarkable powers of observation. Maybe we'll need to pair them with scientists. Maybe we'll ultimately need to do the whole rigorous bit at the back. But it strikes me that, one of the best ways you can have more scientific discovery is simply through more observation, more curiosity.
Yeah.
And in particular, I think, a readiness to look at trivial things
Hmm.
and ask why.
Hmm.
In Darwin's case, a lot of what he was doing. I mean, if he hadn't actually put a theory on top of it, a lot of what he was doing, going around the place, experimenting with tortoises and finches and goodness knows what else, it would have paid for I mean, they were extraordinary people, some of those Victorians who would just go and like measure
Absolutely.
things, record things, draw things. I mean, it was a kind of, I mean, I suspect they were all kind of non-neurotypical in a way. There was some weird
Mm,
urge to quantify and categorize and everything else.
mm.
But it's very, I mean, very weird thing to spend your time doing in a way. But
Yeah.
but what we don't seem to do, we should really be seeking to maximize observation.
Mm,
And it struck me that, have we actually lost this knack in that if you take the COVID pandemic, you had a lot of very clever scientific minds who are going, oh, I want data. Okay. My only quibble with that, okay, is that the thing about COVID is it was airborne, right? And yet, until very, very late in the pandemic, nobody actually said, look, this is airborne. To be honest, you wear an N95 mask, you can go outside, you can do what you like. You can't eat in public, you can't sing in public, you can't drink in public, because that requires you to take your mask off. But if you'd wandered around with an N95 mask, a mask, probably, and I mean, you probably out of doors, you weren't going to catch it much anyway. Indoors, if you'd masked up whenever you're in any kind of crowded space, you'd probably be okay. But why did nobody notice the fact that there didn't seem to be outdoor transmission and say,
mm,
okay, look, there just seemed to be a kind of. So the problem with data is that you only really request data on things that you think are important to begin with.
mm,
But if you're wrong about what's important to begin with, you'll just collect data that doesn't help you at all, or which
mm,
is completely irrelevant. And so I'm a
mm,
huge fan of just going, basically, of just looking at stuff and asking questions that nobody else has asked, just noticing
mm,
something. There's a lovely story about this, by the way. Sometimes I think great entrepreneurial ideas are because someone notices a technology and realizes that the rules have changed because this new technology exists. And I love this story because it's always told as an example of fantastic sort of ingenuity. The Fosbury flop, 1966 Olympics. No, that must be 1968. 1968 Olympics, okay. Dick Fosbury, world champion and Olympic champion at the high jump, because he goes over the bar backwards, whereas previously everybody else went over the high jump sort of 1 foot first.
mm,
And I dug into that. Was that just an amazing idea? Nobody thought of that before. Right?
mm,
Were they all going, no, 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 we got to go over forwards? Now, it turns out that it had been known for some time that you could jump higher over a bar if you went back first and head first versus going like foot first. That was already known.
mm,
What Fosbury noticed was that up until recent years, when you did the high jump at the Olympics or at other athletic competitions, you landed basically on a wicker mat. So if you went back first and landed on your back, you might do a very high jump, but let's be honest, you probably wouldn't be around to do very many of them because you'd be seriously injured or, knock yourself out or be in extreme pain or generally ruin your athletic career. What Fosbury noticed is by the time it came to 1968, the wicker mats had become mattresses and the mattresses had become thicker and thicker. And he realized that the thickness on the mattress on which you're expected to land after doing an Olympic high jump was now basically, I can't remember what it was, 8 inches, a foot thick, which made it perfectly safe to land on your back without the threat of injury.
mm,
And that's in a way a feat of observation, which is, oh, look, something's changed. I always give the example of the Uber map, which is, one of
mm,
the two founders of Uber had that brilliant insight, which is, well, with the combination of two pretty simple technologies, which is GPS and live mapping and the smartphone, proliferation of the smartphone. We can't make taxis appear any quicker, but we can make waiting for a taxi a lot less frustrating, because once people can see where their taxi is and they're confident that it's going to arrive and they know when to expect it, 90% of their anxiety about waiting for a taxi basically disappears.
mm,
And that was what you might call noticing something.
mm,
And I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, I dig into the history of things. You realize that nearly everything which we just assume is like part of progress, there's a marketing story to it as well as a kind of technological story. The interesting one is there's an American brand which still exists called White Castle.
Okay.
And before there was McDonald's, before there was Burger King, there was White Castle.
Huh.
And it was really the first of the burger chains. I'm probably doing a slight disservice to somebody else, but it was very, very early on as selling burgers. And you assume, okay, what could be more American than eating burgers? Americans, they must love burgers. Burgers, that's what, American, give them a choice of something to eat, they'll probably choose a burger. Actually, apparently, if you go back to the beginning of the last century, Americans were very, very suspicious of minced beef for any kind of minced meat, because Sinclair Lewis, I think it was, had written a kind of expose of the conditions in the Chicago stockyards. There was generally the idea that anything minced, as opposed to steak, where you absolutely got a recognizable bit of the cow, the assumption was that anything minced would contain all kinds of gunk and hooves and tongues and eyelashes and everything else, all buried in with the rest of the meat. And basically, because it was all minced, you wouldn't be able to tell where anything came from. And therefore, minced meat was considered basically a way of selling low quality meat and disguising its poor quality. And White Castle, people actually love minced beef when made into a burger because the fat and the muscle is all mixed up. And White Castle overcame this, apparently, by basically, this is extraordinary, really. They created completely open kitchens, which were spotlessly clean, and they actually minced the beef in the view of the customer. And this is going, I can't remember, this is 1920, 1930. I can't remember when White Castle originally kicked off. You can go and have a look at it on Wikipedia. It's worth a read. Because I mean, they still exist. The reason they never got as big as McDonald's are partly they're still family owned. They didn't want they didn't want to franchise. They didn't want to expand. They just wanted to be a family owned, family controlled restaurant. They're still there. But they're probably, that was an extraordinary marketing insight, which is that people love this stuff, but they don't trust it. We'll then create the kitchen environment, which makes it really trustworthy.
Right. So, Rory, something that I was really curious about is how you learn. So, could you give us a peep into your process? And the reason I ask this is that I find that you have this compendium of insights, and then at the same time you're able to abstract out into these grand rules, right? So how do you learn?
Recurring patterns. I wouldn't go so far as to say rules, because the problem with having rules in marketing, as I've often said, is the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. Sometimes it's a good idea to give the customer exactly what they want. Sometimes it's a good idea not to refuse the customer what they want. And sometimes it's a good idea to have a big menu. Sometimes it's a good idea to have a small menu. Sometimes it's a good idea, like In-N-Out, to have a small menu and a secret menu. So I wouldn't like to say there are rules. What I would say is there are lots of recurring patterns which I think can work across different categories, if only we learned how to properly categorize them and classify them. And the other thing I probably do, if I'm being honest, is two things. I slightly grumble about the advertising industry because it's always delivered insights as if they're Fabergé eggs. And that goes back to the day where you needed one insight to lead to one big TV campaign. And you had one insight every 18 months and you guarded it preciously. And you sold this insight as if it was, a bottle of vintage Chateau Lafite or a Fabergé egg, something incredibly rare and precious. And I kind of want to sell insights like Coca-Cola. I want to go, look, there are lots of them out there. They could be useful for you. Maybe some of you don't like them. They don't work in your business. But there are a lot of insights out there into consumer psychology, which might get you out of some shit or might help your business grow. I want to be a kind of diffusion brand for insights rather than Donna Karan or Ralph Lauren purple label. I want to be the kind of polo diffusion brand which makes these things more widely known, because I think we have an economic duty to help small businesses get better at marketing. Because there's there's nothing sadder, nothing more wasteful. Even when you consider environmental questions, everything like that. There's nothing sadder than having a brilliant idea for a business that fails because no one knows how to market it. And by the way, that's not easy, because it absolutely fascinates the hell out of me, really, where you have a company with the ability and the resources of Apple, all right, and they've produced this thing for whatever reason called the Vision Pro, and genuinely, I think nobody has the faintest idea whether this is going to be the next big thing or whether it's a load of old bollocks. In other words, consumer adoption and widespread adoption of technology is such a strange business that you can literally spend billions developing something with some of the best science. Now, is that recent? Because I always think that when I was a kid, I grew up this is probably more common still in India, okay? But I grew up in the 1970s, and generally you wanted things, and the reason you didn't have them is because you couldn't afford them, broadly speaking, okay? There was a sort of mentality in 1968 or 1973 where you go, I really like a microwave, but they're too expensive, so we can't afford one, I'd really like. And now we almost, I think, have this new marketing problem. Bill Gates said people don't know how to want the things we can offer them. I think we have this new marketing problem where people could afford the thing, they kind of want it, but they don't believe in it, or they think it's too good to be true, or they don't like the user imagery of the product, and therefore they're reluctant to use it. I think we suddenly have these cases where products fail or succeed on surprisingly kind of arbitrary psychological bases. Broadly speaking, everybody in 1978 wanted this kind of car and that kind of television, and they wanted a bigger television, and those things were kind of universally agreed. And the reason you didn't have them came down to money and priorities. Maybe I'd like a bigger television, but I want to go on a foreign holiday. But, broadly speaking, you did what you could afford. And now we have this weird kind of superabundance, where in many ways, where people actually decide to pay and play is increasingly down to arbitrary psychological factors. And it's just kind of strange, I suppose. I mean, it is different, and I think we will have to acknowledge that. Why did you go to a cafe in 1978? Because you were hungry and it was there. Now you kind of decide whether you want, Deliveroo or Just Eat or Uber Eats, or or to collect a takeaway, or to go and have a meal kit delivered, and effectively we're making choices between these things, not really on the basis of, I think, real utility. There's just something else going on. It's just how it makes you feel, or it's often mood dependent, I suspect. Right. And it does mean that you can have a brilliant idea and market it badly and it will fail. By the way, I mean, it's worth noting that every single really good idea has required a hell of a lot of marketing. I know that sounds weird. History never records this. I always assumed, if you take, one of the 20 best ideas anybody's ever had in terms of its importance, the Edward Jenner and smallpox vaccination, wasn't the first person to spot it, by the way, actually, if we're being fair. There was another farmer who spotted it. But he just spots the fact that milkmaids get cowpox, which seems to confer some degree of immunity from smallpox. That was probably known a little bit kind of anecdotally already. I mean, it's interesting that the milkmaid in 18th century English literature is a bit of a kind of, porny, slight sort of, sexual goddess, and that may just be because their skin was fantastic. I don't, because they hadn't had smallpox. I don't know, but it is interesting, the role of the milkmaid in this. I mean, maybe they just had a lot of calcium, but but the interesting thing was that he then realizes, okay, a very, very good thing. If we deliberately infect people with cowpox, maybe that means they won't get smallpox. He does an experiment on the son of his gardener, which is, of course, completely unethical, where he infects him with cowpox and then deliberately attempts to infect him with smallpox, which I don't think will get through ethical review, to be honest. Okay,
Yeah.
but the interesting thing there, the really interesting thing there, in a sense, is that I always assumed, okay, once he'd done this, he demonstrated the experiment, everybody went, yeah, sodding hell, mate, that's brilliant, absolutely fantastic. It means that a quarter of the world's population don't have to either die or risk serious disfigurement while having an incredibly unpleasant pustular disease. Well done, mate. Have a knighthood and a big house in the country. Basically, he's had to spend most of his life persuading people that this was a good idea. There was religious opposition. There was opposition from actually the medical establishment, who made money out of an earlier practice called variolation. And this idea that this is a story that we always tell ourselves when we buy something. We never say, I bought that because it was really well marketed. We go, I bought it because it's a great product. Nobody ever says, I bought the iPhone because I thought the marketing was fantastic. They go, oh, no, it's a brilliant phone. But I can imagine a world in which Steve Jobs was just 30% less charismatic, where we're all going around still in 2024 using phones with keyboards. I've never said this to Greg Jackson. There's a very brilliant energy company in the UK, clean green energy company called Octopus Energy. And they've got a cuddly pink octopus as their logo. And they're now worth a few billion quid, deservedly so, because they're a very good business. And I know the CEO, and I've never had the balls to say this, but you do realize in marketing terms, right, there's a fairly high probability that if you hadn't called yourself Octopus and had a nice, memorable pink logo of a cuddly animal, and you'd instead call yourself something like Clean Gen Tech, right? I think there's a more than 50% chance you probably wouldn't exist anymore, or you'd have like 30,000 customers. Okay, this is when you said I notice weird things. I think the only reason I notice weird things is that when I look at things, to be honest, I'm in advertising because it's a great way to monetize ADHD. But I don't have a sense of proportion. I don't go, that is a big successful energy company, which must mean it has superior kind of pricing, billing, supply chain management, and enjoys economies of scale. That's the Harvard Business School explanation for a successful company. I will actually go, maybe it's a really successful company because its logo is a cuddly pink octopus. And by the way, there's a great book actually by a guy called Brian Klaas, Klaas, called Fluke.
Okay.
And it's called Fluke. And you realize that the reality in which we live, is a little bit the product of design. It's a little bit the product of evolution and selection. A hell of a lot of it, a hell of a lot of extraordinary things are the product of like utter fucking, the whole of World War One, sort of happened because the chauffeur to the Archduke Franz Ferdinand got lost, and it was very difficult to get the car into reverse. I mean, literally, these things hang on a kind of stupid thread, right? I was watching a documentary about the Battle of Midway. Fantastic and glorious, American victory over the Japanese Navy in World War II. And you realize that a whole load of these things were just total, they were just fluke events, a single bomb hitting hitting the loading bay, I think it is, in a Japanese aircraft carrier at the time when they were moving from one type of bomb to another kind of bomb. So there were lots of bombs lying around, so the whole ship blows up. But you actually realize that, a large chunk of World War II in the Pacific hangs on pretty tiny stuff. And so one of the things I'm perfectly happy to accept, which most people aren't, is that really major things can have really trivial explanations. That marketing can work because you've got a cuddly octopus as your logo. I mean, genuinely, I can explain that in serious terms, which is that generally speaking, advertising with animals in it and brands that identify with an animal are more successful than brands that don't. Okay.
Speaking to the...
I think there's an evolutionary reason for that, which is we've just evolved to pay attention to animals. Because they might eat us, or maybe we could eat them. It kind of matters.
Yeah. I was speaking to the founder of an Indian supermarket chain recently, and the conversation veered towards the main reasons why brands fail, and the first two things that that he came up with were bad logo, bad name. So those two main reasons for why brands fail, and he was the founder of one of the largest supermarkets in India. So pretty important, I think.
You can succeed with a bad logo and a bad name in that if you're good enough in other ways, it just becomes so familiar that it means something. I mean, I'm always fascinated. Just a total aside. I don't know if you have it in India, but there was a kind of crime detective program called Murder, She Wrote. Right?
No.
Okay, no. And I always get Murder. I always just think, how on earth? How did they have that meeting, right, where they agreed the title? It didn't actually mean anything. Okay, who on earth kind of thought that would be a great name for a... Now, for whatever reason, once the thing becomes reasonably popular, everybody goes, did you see Murder, She Wrote? Now it's a nonsensical sentence, right? Did you see Murder, She Wrote last night? Yeah, it was quite good, yeah. And you can somehow just... Kodak was just invented as a name and so on. But he's not totally wrong in that if you have a bad approach in general to design, I think you're at a disadvantage, because I think design can be incredibly eloquent in terms of saying things which communicating things which in a way can't be said in words, but which can be communicated through just a whole approach with design thinking and that kind of thing.
True. What do you think explains people's general aversion to advertising? I mean, what do you think explains that?
It depends. I mean, first of all, I mean, I can accept the fact that some advertising is annoying, is useless, is utility damaging. In its defense, it does fund the media to some extent. In other words, David Ogilvy, interestingly, always hated billboards. And one of the reasons he hated billboards was that, or outdoor advertising, was that he said, in every other form of advertising, there's kind of implicit contract with the consumer, which is we're funding the programs, and in return, you'll listen to us for 30 seconds at the end. And he said a billboard simply uglifies a street or a landscape without, other than maybe paying the farmer or the landowner, it doesn't bring any corresponding benefit to the consumer. Now, that could change with digital billboards, and I've argued this. With digital billboards, they could mix advertising with useful information, like, the Jubilee line is out of action. Here's an ad for something. The weather today, it's expected to rain in half an hour. Here's an ad for something. You could have billboards, digital rotating billboards, which actually sort of fulfilled that contract. And I imagine David would have been happier with those. But leaving that aside, I mean, a lot of advertising is very useful. It's very, very old. It's also necessary because you can't buy something if you don't know it exists in most cases. It also enables you, it provides you with kind of information both in the explicit form and also in other forms which we're not really consciously aware of, like someone who can afford to advertise and chooses to do so probably is a going concern business with genuine faith in the future popularity of their product. So it's a mark of seller confidence. And it's a mark of seller confidence that you can't really fake, given that it costs you money to place an ad. And so advertising provides people with a lot of information, both explicit and implicit, which they can actually use to make better heuristic purchase decisions. And then, there's some very clever, very simple uses. There was a beautiful case in Britain this was about 25 years ago. There's a financial company called Cornhill, and they sold most of their pensions and investment products through independent financial advisors.
Okay.
And the financial advisors said, look, we really like your products. They're good value for money. We think they do a great job. The only problem is when we recommend Cornhill products to our clients, they always go, who the hell are they? Okay. And so Cornhill went out and they spent quite a lot of money, but not an insane amount of money, sponsoring the test matches. So they were known as, if you had England, Australia, England, India, it'd be known in the UK as the Cornhill test or the third Cornhill test. And from that moment on, the independent financial advisors went to their clients and said, I'd recommend a pension from Cornhill, you know, the people who sponsor the cricket. Everyone went, yeah, that's fine. Okay, right. That was a perfect example of just, in other words, do something visibly expensive to show that you're a reputable business with, if you like, some degree of skin in the game, and that you have, you know, some degree of fame, which gives people confidence that they're not being sold something utterly obscure. And also because you're famous, if there's a scandal with Cornhill, it's going to get into the newspapers because you're now more famous.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's more newsworthy if you do something bad. So there is an element which is the reputation, the brand reputation is a double-edged sword for a business. It allows them to sell at a premium for as long as they are actually being square and decent to the customer. But actually having a famous brand reputation when you screw up, that's the other edge of the sword. It's actually much, much worse. You actually, and it's that very vulnerability, it's that very reputational vulnerability that to some extent makes brands trustworthy. I mean, I was listening, I'll give you an example of this, which is, when you think about it, extraordinary. So I was listening to the radio in the UK about 10 years ago, and there was a news item in the UK about an outbreak of food poisoning at a McDonald's in Schaumburg, Illinois. Okay.
Right.
Now, this was of no relevance to me. Okay. It's 4,000 miles away, for God's sake, right? And it occurred to me the only reason it was newsworthy was because it was McDonald's. If you've got a brand like that, you're incredibly reputationally vulnerable to scandal, food poisoning, a dead rat being found around the back of the building. Okay. Because it's literally 100. I mean, look, I'm sure people get the shits in Schaumburg, Illinois, every goddamn day of the week in independent family-run restaurants, right?
Yeah.
It probably does. It might make it into the local paper. It certainly wouldn't make it into the British news, right? But when it's the McDonald's, bang! You know, it's rather like, you know, being a celebrity. You know, you can, you know,
right.
The slightest thing, right?
Correct. Yeah.
You know, you're vulnerable to the slightest bit of negative publicity.
Yeah, even the most local of news, it just blows up to be global in a way.
It can blow up. Yeah. I mean, I remember that. I must say, even listening at the time, I thought, well, I'm not quite sure where you're carrying this story, mate, because I wasn't, you know, I wasn't sure where I was going to eat the next day, but I wasn't planning to fly to Schaumburg, Illinois to go to McDonald's. But and you know, fame, by the way, it's worth noting, and I don't think we talk about fame enough because it sounds banal. You know, oh, you know, if we go in and we're a load of Oxbridge graduates and an ad agency, we say we're going to make you famous. That makes us sound a bit thick, really, as if, you know, you haven't really thought about this. No,
Yeah.
You should be talking about brand iconography. But actually, being famous is extraordinarily important, because if you're not famous, you have to find all your customers. If you're famous, customers you never knew existed come and find you. And that's a really important distinction. If you, first of all, they're more confident in you because they've heard of you from somebody else, or they've heard that other people have heard of you. So you gain that kind of trust. No, it's not irrational, by the way. I think it's perfectly rational. If you look at the kind of what you might call reputational dynamics that are going on, you have that level of trust, but also you're the person that the customers that they don't know about. Now, I think there's this daft thing in digital. There's this daft story which pervades digital marketing, which is that people conceive a want in advance, and then they go in a methodical way about satisfying that want at the lowest possible cost through searching online and da 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 da.
Right.
But yeah, and by the way, that happens some of the time. But I think an awful lot of human purchase behavior doesn't operate in that way at all, which is you see something that interests you and you go and buy it. Okay. And I think this idea of optimizing digital marketing to satisfy at the lowest cost possible pre-existing needs is quite rightly part of marketing, because that's what you should be doing. If there's existing demand out there, you should be satisfying it as economically as you can, or at least as, you know, to within the realms of profitability with every customer who's willing to buy. But I think
Right.
that's actually taken people's eye off the ball of actually creating demand, of demand generation, which is fundamentally different, which is, I never thought I wanted one of those, but now you mention it, I think I do.
Right.
You know, I mean, you know, I'll give you an example of that. I mean, you can buy in the UK, I think only 2 people make them, a glass-sided toaster. And it's a brilliant thing because you put in a crumpet or you put in a muffin, and just when it's the right amount of brown, you can hit eject. You know, now if you always toast the same kind of bread, it doesn't matter. You have a setting and it toasts your bread to the right level. But if you toast lots of different things, then actually the glass-sided toaster is brilliant because you can use your eyes to determine when to stop toasting. Now, you can't want one of those unless you know it exists. Now, I think most people who know a glass-sided toaster exists would say, well, next time I buy a toaster, I'll buy one with glass sides. But what's kind of weird, actually in America, they have those weird horizontal things now, don't they, for sort of bagel toasting, which tend to have a glass front. Good idea. But if you just go to Amazon and search for toaster, it doesn't tell you about a glass toaster. It sells you a load of boring toasters at varying degrees of cheapness, some from recognizable brands, some from somewhere else. That actually, you know, there's a whole value to having information out there in advance of it being necessary for a purchase decision. And I think we've just taken this idea of funnels and demand chains as kind of linear entities. And I think we've kind of said, okay, this is a simple optimization problem. You know, it's an efficiency optimization problem. And as I said, yeah, that's perfectly true. As far as you can do that, you can, but don't expect to grow all that much if that's all you ever do. Because you're defining your customers not as those people with whom ultimately we can have a profitable relationship, but you're defining your customers as those people who are prepared to engage with us spontaneously in low-cost channels.
Right.
And I don't think that's the same thing. I don't think that's the same thing. Or rather, I think one's a subset of the other. But you won't grow very successfully as a brand unless you actually define your target audience by who they could be potentially, rather than those people who are prepared to interact with you in a particular way.
Makes sense. So, I mean, I wanted to ask you about psychological value that you describe in your book. So how would you describe psychological value to a novice? And in a Jungian sense, do you think humans have established archetypes of psychological value?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. There's a whole debate in economics which kind of fascinates me, which revolves around the question, which is utility or preference in decision making, is it cardinal or ordinal?
Okay.
And the newer, more mathematical economists like to believe it's what you might call cardinal, which is not only do you prefer an air fryer to a microwave, but you think that an air fryer is 1.7 times more valuable than a microwave at the same price, whatever. And other schools of economics, in particular the Austrian school, don't think that's meaningful. They say you can say you prefer, with the given money, you choose to do one thing over another, but you don't actually attach a kind of proportional value to it. It's simply a matter of doing one thing rather than the other. And unfortunately, if you start investigating this debate, it gets very nerdy very fast. And I was reading about it this morning. But I don't think we have a cardinal. I have to say, I don't think we have a cardinal view of value. And I'll give you a thought experiment to explain that, I think, which is, let's imagine, okay, that your home broadband. Where are you in India, by the way?
I'm in Bombay. I
Bombay.
am from. Yeah, I'm in Bombay.
Let's say your broadband was controlled by the local mafia. And they came
Right.
around and they said, lovely home broadband connection, you've got there, proceed. But wouldn't it be a pity if someone like cut the cable? And you go, yeah, I wouldn't like that at all. Yeah. Well, fortunately, we have a cable protection service where you can pay us so many rupees a month and we'll make sure your cable doesn't get cut, i.e. implicit threat. You'd probably pay for your home broadband, I don't know, 3 or 4 times as much as you currently pay. You wouldn't be happy about it, but you probably pay 4 times as much as you actually pay for your home broadband to make sure you kept having it. Which suggests that your broadband, in terms of the consumer surplus, is actually 3 or 4 times. I mean, I'd certainly pay a couple of £100 a month, possibly more to have broadband if that was what it cost. But it doesn't cost that. It costs about £40 in my case.
Right.
But when I pay my broadband bill, I don't think every month that's brilliant because there's something that's worth £300 to me or £400 to me, and I only have to pay 40 for it. I'm getting a consumer surplus of £360. I don't think like that. I go £40, that's about right for broadband. Now, if I had a genuine theory of value, I'd be conscious all the time. The same would go for probably flat screen TVs. I don't know. I think that richer people, not everybody, but richer people would probably pay $5,000 for a flat screen TV if that's what they cost. Or they would have done by now. But they don't cost that. They cost about $600, $700. But people don't go, wow, that's amazing. I've got something I would be prepared to pay $7,000 for, but it only actually costs $700. And so if you want to express this thought in a sentence, it's that we don't, and actually it's a bit of a tragedy in a way, okay, because a lot of miraculous things which we should get really excited by because they're cheap. Think of things like computer games or Spotify, right? Or, if you think of Spotify, oh yeah. I mean, okay, Spotify, bear in mind I was born in 1965. So Spotify to me is, hey, how would you like the whole of fucking music? Like you've got the best music collection. You've got a better music collection than any of the Beatles has, anybody has, and you've got to pay a few pounds a month for it. You go, no, that's a miracle. We just go, yeah, it's $14.99. It seems about right. Yeah. That's what you paid for a single DVD and that was when 14 quid was like 25. Yeah. That's what you paid for a single goddamn DVD when I was a student. CD when I was a student. And now I pay that every month and I get all music, right? Now, admittedly, I need a separate one for classical music because the Spotify search is absolutely rubbish if you're trying to listen to classical music, which I use a thing called Adagio, by the way, if you want a good tip. It's okay. Really quite good. But I don't think we have an idea of what things are worth that's independent of what they cost. Now, if I'm right in that and we don't get any pleasure from the consumer surplus, it does occur to me that when you have a reasonably large number of customers, there are probably more customers who would be grateful for you improving your product rather than reducing the price. Because if I'm already prepared to pay £40 for my broadband and now I have to pay 35, okay, there will be a chunk of people who can't afford to pay £40 for their broadband or aren't prepared to and will pay 35. And by dropping the price to £35, okay, then it will effectively make those people more likely to buy. So you will grow your market a bit. But I don't think you, to be honest, I hate to say this, but I don't think you create that much happiness in me because I was happy to pay 40. Maybe what you should do to create happiness with me is continue making me pay £40 for my broadband and make the service better. Improve it in some way, have a better call center, upgrade something or other. So just to make something very clear, when I'm talking about this idea of what idea of value do we have, I'm being highly speculative. I'm not making a definitive comment, but I am just saying that to some degree, people think things are worth what they cost, that they don't have an independent assessment of their value. I mean, very strange thing, the unbelievably good artist at the Flowers Gallery who takes these extraordinary photographs of the Thames and then prints them on kind of aluminium. It's an extraordinary thing. I didn't buy one because they're a few £1,000s and I'm not quite in that kind of art market.
Okay.
But I think I would have done And I'm also conscious of the fact that if I'd gone in and seen them for £200 or £100, would I have liked them so much? I have no idea. I mean, if you look at things like the art market, the wine market, there are patently large parts of the economy which don't fulfill normal rules. I mean, we obviously know about Veblen goods and luxury goods. My friend, a brilliant guy called Joe Fattorini, who's both a behavioral economics guru and a wine expert, says that effectively, if you look at wine purchase, people don't buy wine for quality, they pay more to mark an occasion. So they either want to signal they're being generous if they're giving someone a bottle of wine, or if they're hosting a dinner party, they buy more expensive wine to show they're being generous to their guests. And if you go out for a restaurant meal, if it's someone's birthday, if it's a celebration of a pitch win, okay, if it's someone's wedding anniversary, if someone's just graduated from university, you kind of double what you spend on wine as a way of marking the occasion. It's kind of anthropological, really. It's not really economic in that sense. And so much of what we do is anthropological still, that for economics to kind of muscle out anthropology. I mean, I'll give you an example of just pure anthropology, okay? If you had a much loved family pet die, you wouldn't put it in the bin. There's no reason. You could chuck, assuming it's a cat, you just chuck it in the bin, put it out for the bin men. Virtually nobody would do that, I think. Okay. An awful lot of our behavior is fundamentally mediated by signaling, I guess, by certain senses of things like reciprocation and reciprocality. If you'd had a very loyal dog, the idea of not burying it with some degree of respect would just seem completely wrong, even though there's absolutely no economic reason not to do that.
Yeah, I mean, by you saying something?
No, all fine. Carry on. Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I was just going to ask you about, I mean, what do you think most closely explains the over-reliance on spreadsheet-driven logic as the instrument of choice for business decision making? I mean, do you think it's mostly a supply side?
I think what maths can do if you manipulate it is provide you with the illusion of a single right answer, to which any other alternative must be subordinate and suboptimal. And anybody, now, if you notice, none of us as consumers in every day, including accountants, by the way, none of us buys a car and does a cost benefit analysis. Actually, it's not quite true. A few people do. I had a friend, a great guy, marketing guy, who addressed an audience of 400 kind of accountants and said, okay, how many of you did a cost benefit analysis before buying a car? And he said about 4 hands out of 400 went up. And he said, possibly unfairly, hands attached to the most boring people you've ever seen in your life. Okay. But even a tiny minority of accountants will do a cost benefit analysis before they decide whether to buy an Audi or a Mercedes. I'm not saying they don't look at financial specifications or cost or interest rates or leasing facilities. They look at that, but they also allow that numerical and factual information to cohabit with emotional considerations. There are certain things like how much you like the goddamn car, right? Because if there's a car brand which meets all your financial criteria, but you feel like a piece of shit driving it, okay, that actually defeats the object of buying a nice car in the first place, and you might as well take the bus to work. Now, what happens in an institutional setting is it's not so important to arrive at an optimal decision as it is to arrive at a decision that's easy to defend and explain and justify. And so people use effectively mathematical reasoning, balance score sheets, cost benefit analyses. You can imagine all these kind of tools to effectively make decisions for them, so that they can avoid the risk of blame by being accused of using any form of subjective judgment whatsoever in the decision they either recommend or implement.
Hmm.
And the problem with that is there's an awful lot of important information in any decision which doesn't really submit to quantification.
Hmm.
Okay, let's say you're buying a car. You can quantify fuel economy, you can quantify acceleration, you can quantify top speed, you can quantify, service intervals, you can quantify the interest rate you'd pay on buying the thing. All those things are numerical, but say comfort, right? First of all, there isn't really a number for comfort, or number of, I suppose, number of cup holders would be, but how whether your kids like it, how much boot space it's got. Those things become incommensurable after a time. You can't actually develop a formula which says I'm prepared to sacrifice 2 cubic liters, 2 liters of boot space in exchange for 0.1 seconds off the 0 to 60 time of acceleration. They're not really, they're not really capable of being reduced to an internally consistent framework. So at some level, you have to use heuristics, you have to use, some degree of subjective judgment. And as a consequence, I would argue, you make a better decision because you're considering more variables. Okay, even if the variables aren't directly comparable, you're nonetheless considering things like, well, actually, image, emotional pleasure you derive from the car, highly ridiculous, okay? Or trustworthiness of the person selling the car, okay? That's a factor. Actually, if you're buying a second-hand car, pretty high up the list is not, is, okay, you could try and reduce that to a number, but do I trust this guy not to be selling me a dodgy car? That's a big factor. Okay. Now, what you try and do in order to look scientific is to use no subjective information whatsoever, which in some ways may look incredibly kind of impartial and logical, but you're equally freezing certain bits of consideration completely out of the equation. Okay. And actually, I mean, you have this with ad agencies. You pitch, and the clients are all given this balanced scorecard, and you have to rate the agency on strategy, whether you like them or not. Their creative, capabilities, the quality of the creative work they've presented, the so and so and this, and they all give this balanced scorecard. And what they're supposed to do is give a score and then add them all up and go, "Oh, it looks like I've chosen them." Do they do that? Do they bollocks? They choose the agency they want to win, and then they backfill the numbers to get the result they want. And also, by the way, is the process, here's another question. Let's say you have, okay, agency, strategic ability, likability of team, and creative ability, okay? Are those numbers, are they additive or are they multiplicative? Because in a way, they're additive, right? But actually, right, let's say they're creatively brilliant and they're strategically brilliant, but you can't stand them. In other words, the idea of working with these people would just be utterly repellent. Okay. Well, that's got to be a naught across the board. Right? Okay. Really? Because it doesn't matter how good they are at something else if they're absolutely shit at one thing. So, this attempt to reduce, it's scientism is what Hayek called it. The attempt to reduce complex decisions for which we have imperfect information and where not all the information is in numerical or comparable or commensurate form, to reduce those things as though they're a high school maths question, so you can arrive at a single right answer, which is then effectively safe from criticism because it wasn't you who decided, it was the formula. Okay, that's actually not a manifestation of science, that's a manifestation of bureaucracy. It's effectively an attempt to evade accountability for the decision by pretending that you didn't make it at all because you actually just arrived at it through numerical means. And it's bullshit. I mean, it's absolute crap. Okay, I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult in a business to tell the difference between arse covering and rigor. And it's very easy for people to pretend they're being rigorous about a decision. Bring in McKinsey, do this, that, and analysis. And well, all they're really doing is building a 400-page PowerPoint deck to cover their own arse for a decision that, to be honest, they probably made before they even started the process of justifying it. And so it's incredibly wasteful, in fact. It's, you know, it's actually, it makes decisions very slow. It makes them very unimaginative. And then you get this really strange thing, and it baffled me this for years. And I only understood it when I read a book by Dan Davis called The Unaccountability Machine, which I recommend you all read. It's a, I've already mentioned Brian Klaas's Fluke. The Unaccountability Machine is really, really good as a book to read. It's a weird book, but it's great. Because the thing I never really understood is that if you went to, let's say, clients or a certain type of mindset, and you said, actually, there's more than one way of solving this problem. Let's have some creative ideas. Have you thought of looking at it like this rather than looking at it like that? Because if you look at it like this, if you recontextualize or if you reconfigure the definition of the problem, your problem becomes a lot easier to solve through just creative ingenuity and reframing of the question. And I always thought, well, okay, I wouldn't mind if those people are neutral when you do that. They just go, yeah, don't really like your ideas. I'd understand it if they're positive, because you go, well, thanks, mate, because by helping me look at this solution this problem in 3 different ways, you've expanded my solution set. And some of the new solutions that have become apparent to me through your deployment of creativity might be cheaper and more effective than the ones I've come up with so far. So thank you very much for increasing the odds by which I can efficiently and effectively solve this problem. That would be a perfectly reasonable response as well. But the response you often get is anger, which is you're messing with my single linear argument, which arrives at a single conclusion. And by adding subjective variables into the equation, even though you're undoubtedly improving the likelihood of solving this problem effectively, you're now messing with my self-justification. And so I've always asked the question, why didn't we give the brief for High Speed 2 in the UK, the fast railway between Manchester and London? What would have happened if you'd given the brief to Disney? Rather than giving it to a load of engineers. Now, the first thing Disney would have said is, okay, we're not happy with your definition of the problem. It's all about speed and time and capacity. We're not really interested in that because we're Disney, because, you know, actually sometimes people find slow roller coasters more enjoyable than fast roller coasters or whatever. Speed is just a variable which doesn't particularly well correlate with human motivation or enjoyment. Yeah, people wouldn't go to Manchester on a train that took 9.5 hours unless it was like a sleeper train, I guess. Okay, well, there you go, lateral solution. Okay, but I get that. The train's got to be reasonably fast. Disney aren't complete idiots, right? But they wouldn't say, okay, we're going to develop a model where for every minute saved, we'll value at £1 billion. What Disney would say is, look, you're asking the wrong question here. You're talking about how you get people from London to Manchester. You're not asking the question about why they should go to Manchester in the first place or why they should go by train. So what Disney would have said, I surmise, is let's forget about speed, capacity, frequency, or punctuality, okay? The question we need to answer is, how can we make the rail journey between London and Manchester so enjoyable people feel stupid going by car? Okay, that's now a behavioral question. It's a psychological question. It's a better question, right? Undoubtedly, if the purpose of this thing is to get people out of cars and into trains, okay, we can debate how many people we need to make that shift. But if that's the purpose of the activity, let's go and define the problem that way. And at that point, what will happen is everybody will get really uncomfortable because you've now defined your objective as enjoyableness, not speed. And there isn't a numerical value for enjoyableness. And what's more, you can create it in lots of different ways. Now, you'd think that's a good thing because making a journey fun, there are 100 ways of making a journey fun. There's only one way of making a journey fast. More ways to solve the problem. But you've got to choose which of those fun ways you adopt. You don't have a mathematical model for telling you which one. So now you're asked to make a subjective decision, which means you're no longer a bureaucrat. You're actually an entrepreneur. And that's not acceptable. And it's really, really interesting because creativity that expands the solution set is often met with hostility, not gratitude. And the very reason it's people react with hostility is precisely because it expands the solution set. So it expands the solution set to a point where it has more than one right answer, which now means I might have to make a decision using other than maths.
Right. Do you also think there's have you contended with the possibility that maybe, there is an oversupply of spreadsheet ninjas in the world?
Emphatically, yeah. Because in many cases, the data that isn't there, or the data that can't be there because it isn't available in numerical form, is the data that really matters. So you're effectively, it's a bit like, I'm being a bit unfair, but if I always joke that Americans, one of their major discriminators in buying a car is number of cup holders. Okay. Now actually it's not totally ridiculous. I rather like cup holders myself. But what I'm saying is that, quite often we think that, the data that's really important is available. And it's available in numerical form, and the stuff that isn't numerically available basically doesn't count because it's unscientific and fluffy and irrelevant.
Right.
But in many decisions, apart from anything else, evolution gave us fairly good sense of smell for fluffy things that you can't actually quantify. Do I trust this person? Right? I've always asked an interesting question there. So let's imagine you set two people out to buy a second-hand car. One of them was an expert in cars, all right, and knew everything about clutches and gearboxes and everything else, right? And the other person was my mum, who didn't know much about cars but knew a lot about people. Now, those two people would use a completely different approach. The car guy would look exclusively at the car. My mum would look at the car a bit to check it wasn't rusting or falling to bits, or didn't have didn't smell of corpse in the trunk or something. She'd look at the car to that extent, but most of her judgment would be focused on the person. Do I trust this person to sell me a reasonably good car? Do I think they have an honest reason for selling the car, or are they trying to offload a car they don't like? Will they feel a sense of shame if they sell me the car and 3 weeks later it conks out? In other words, can I trust this person? Now, they're both looking at completely different, they're both looking at the same problem through a completely different lens. Some of the time, the car guy would buy a better car. Some of the time, my mum would buy the better car. The best thing would be to have my mum going along with the car guy, allowing for the information that's kind of engineering information and, technical information, but also allowing for the human and emotional information, which is, okay, the gearbox may seem really smooth, but the guy could have put, I don't think anybody does this anymore, it was the 1970s, people used to put sawdust in the gearbox because apparently it went really, really well for about 100 miles and then it all seized up. But by that time you'd sold the car. Okay, it used to be an old scam. But, actually my mum would spot if there was something dodgy about, now a car guy might buy a really, really good car, except it's been stolen, right? My mum would probably have had enough crookdar, okay, to pick up if the person buying the car was a wrong un. Okay. So, there are, the best decisions would be taken by a healthy mixture of objective and quantifiable information and softer information. And in fact, if you want to minimize your chance of making a terrible decision, which I would argue is actually the unstated purpose of many decisions, using both is probably a good idea.
Right. True. What do you think about arranged marriages? I mean, is that one of those
whoa.
weird things?
Interesting. I got to clarify this because a lot of people listening to this in the West think an arranged marriage is you're going to marry this person. Now, that does happen, okay? I mean, and it might happen with, for example, far younger children. By the way, it kind of happened with the British royal family. If you go back to them, if you go back to the medieval period, 13-year-old so-and-so was basically married off to the infanta of something else, That's comparatively rare. What generally happens is that it's what Richard Thaler would call managed choice, which is you are presented with options, but you do have final right of veto.
Right. Yeah.
So it is, first of all, the Indian divorce rate is very, very low, so it can't be an incredible catastrophe. Although you could argue, by the way, you could argue that the Indian divorce rate is too low. Okay,
Okay.
in other
Why would you
words,
say?
okay, the only point I'd make, I'm not disputing for a second, I think the divorce rate in the United States and the UK is probably too high. You could argue that social pressure and societal pressure could keep people in completely dysfunctional or even abusive marriages,
Right.
when really they'd be happier splitting up. Okay, so by the way, I'm not saying the Indian divorce rate is too low. I'm saying it's possible that it is. I'm saying that zero, there's a Laffer curve to the divorce rate, and just as you don't want 100% of people getting divorced, you don't want 0% of people getting divorced, or indeed not having the freedom to get divorced because societal norms basically make it impossible. Okay, or you can even get sort of honor killing territory. Okay, I mean, honor killing undoubtedly reduces the divorce rate. I don't think that's a great way to arrive at the to solve the problem. Okay,
Yeah.
But actually, most of it is managed choice, which is you get to choose. It's just that the choice is presented to you in a way that makes it perhaps your parents know things about partners that you yourself don't. Perhaps when you're young, you are more influenced by certain things than other things, and that in a long-term relationship, your parents presumably have a kind of wisdom around what works. So having other party, after all, I mean, there are loads of people in the West who sacrifice the decision to an algorithm, right? I don't know why your parents are assumed to be somehow worse than an algorithm, except I suppose to the extent they don't know as many people. Yeah, there could be a financial dimension to this, which there undoubtedly was in the British royal family, which was it was about dynastic. It was more dynastic than romantic. However, provided not having the right of veto strikes me as extremely dubious, because it could lead to all kinds of problems where you're pressurized into something and then actually you're fundamentally resentful, which is not a good basis, I think, for a relationship. But at the same time, I think it's often misrepresented. I think it's important to note that the phrase arranged marriage is often misunderstood in the Anglosphere and in the West to mean imposed marriage. And for the most part, it isn't like that. There's another question, by the way, which is, in Britain, our curse is that when people have discretionary income, it tends to get spent on property, and property has become a kind of a sump. I do think Indians spend too much on weddings, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, they do. It's one of the top two things they spend on.
Yeah, because you get to a point where you go, well, what's the point in becoming richer if we've just got to spend 70% of our, again, in disposable income on having a now more elaborate wedding? And it's a cultural thing, and I understand a lot of the reasons behind it. But call me a miserable old Anglo-Saxon bastard, but I don't think a wedding should go on for a week and a half, really. Right? Okay.
True.
And by the way, and they are magnificent. And of course, it's worth remembering that a lot of people enjoy them. And of course, you probably get to go to lots of weddings for everyone you have to host. So it's not, it's not a total negative, because you are also, a guest at quite a lot of weddings where you presumably enjoy quite a lot of free hospitality. So it's not, it's not totally, it's not like burning money. Okay. I mean, there are really unattractive things, by the way, around. I mean, I was talking to someone earlier today who more or less single-handedly actually has led a publicity campaign to ban the import and export of shark fins from the UK. It was never banned in the EU because there's a big Spanish market in shark fins where they basically pack them all up and sell them to China. And there's this huge tradition in China where you eat shark fin soup at a wedding. It's not even particularly nice, apparently. In other words, most of the flavor comes from other things. Those kind of things, they're really bad. I mean, okay, I know sharks are kind of a bit scary, but I mean it's a magnificent goddamn animal, right? And to chop the dorsal fin off, okay, use the rest of the body for kind of fertilizer and dog food, and then effectively send the fin off to be used to mark a tradition because it's some story with a Chinese emperor. A chef saved his life by producing shark fin soup, which was something the emperor had never had before and thought was delicious, even though apparently it's not that special. Those kind of things, which are what you might call the product. I mean, Robert H. Frank, brilliant writer, wrote various books called like The Darwin Economy.
Okay.
And when you get extremely competitive displays of consumption, particularly when they have really negative externalities for people or indeed for sharks, okay, that is a form, this sort of peacock's tail runaway, that is a form of kind of, it's a form of irrationality. Now, it gets complicated because then people go, what about luxury fashion? And I go, yeah, up to a point. But I mean, luxury fashion is, you can opt out of it, right?
True.
Well, actually, you can as a guy. I always do wonder, actually, I sympathize with my female colleagues because as a guy, if you just basically go, I just don't care about clothes, certainly after the age of about 35, you can find a pretty low effort route to dressing. I'm not sure that's true for women, and it should be. They should have the same option to be scruffy that we do, and yet nobody weirdly campaigns for that. But some of those practices, which are just the product of what you might call a form of collective insanity. And the wedding question in India is interesting. Do you introduce sumptuary laws? Do you actually cap the duration or the expense? Because if you don't, it's just an inescapable kind of spiral of expenditure. I don't know. It's not for me to say, right? I mean, it's not my responsibility. But speaking as an outside observer, just as I think it'd be perfectly reasonable for someone to say of the British property market, you place so much store in putting your wealth in houses that you've effectively bid up houses to levels which are unaffordable to the young. And you're forcing people to waste an enormous amount of their discretionary wealth on just finding a place to live. I think that's it's a fair criticism, and I suppose you could say, yeah, weddings in India would be a similar question. Just to be honest, I think 90% of this is just discussing it, so that people have the freedom. In other words, it becomes not a complete mindless social norm or imposition. Okay. Yeah, I think I think with arranged marriage, I think you should have the option, I think, to opt out of this and say, look, if you don't mind, I'd rather kind of sort this myself, right? Or at least try and sort it myself, and then if it doesn't work, I'll come back to you. I think, and actually, there's a very, very big. Once you have a discussion about weddings and the nature of weddings, and is this actually impinging on people's ability to educate daughters or children or whatever? Okay, is that similar with the dowry system, of course, as well. Once you start having a discussion about it, you're at least sort of a third of the way there.
Yeah,
because now people are acknowledging, yeah, I never thought of it like that, but there is a bit of a downside here.
So Rory, I'm a successful convert to the religion of the air fryer. I'll probably be getting a Japanese toilet soon.
Oh, the air fryer. So what's your experience with the air fryer? You're a fan, are you? Yeah, I think they're brilliant.
Extraordinary. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Absolutely brilliant. So what are your recent evangelical causes? After the air fryer, the Japanese toilet.
I need a new one. There was something I bought the other day, which was absolutely fantastic, and I've just forgotten what it was. Oh, I have got a thing which I will acknowledge, like the Japanese toilet, is a monstrous extravagance, but is actually quite good, which I've got one of these taps that produces boiling water on demand and filtered water on demand, filtered chilled water on demand, and sparkling water on demand. It's made in this case by a Dutch firm called Quooker, Quooker, but there are other manufacturers who make these. Now, What I'm not saying with the air fryer, I'll say definitely get one, because apart from anything else, it probably saves quite a lot of money because you use much less
Yeah.
electricity heating up an air fryer and much less time than heating up a large oven. And most of the time, we don't use our oven to full capacity. So you're using a sledgehammer to crack an egg when you heat up a large oven for a small item. So with an air fryer, I'd say, if you can afford one reasonably, go and get one. With this
Yeah.
tap, all I would say is it is a monstrous extravagance. My wife resisted it. My daughter was a fan. I can say, and even my wife would acknowledge this, that actually it's much better than you'd expect. That having an instant supply of boiling water, one interesting thing. Oh, the other thing, by the way, is I've got to ask this. When you make chai, as you call it, or masala chai, you obviously end up with a huge number of leaves. One great thing if you make a lot of chai is a waste disposal unit, so you can put it all down the sink. Because
Yeah. Yeah.
I make quite a lot of chai. I love
Okay.
it.
Huh.
Did you know, by the way, it was banned by the British under the Raj? And
Okay. I don't know.
the reason for that, I thought, what a bastard thing to do. Well, but you've got this fantastic spice tea. How can you ban it? And actually, it was actually a law to prevent the adulteration of tea, because there was a
Okay.
problem with tea being adulterated. But the
Okay.
unfortunate byproduct of this bureaucratic law was that actually adding interesting spices to improve tea was also banned under the same legislation, which is a kind of lesson for
Right.
a very interesting lesson for how well-intentioned legislation can actually prevent innovation. So I thought I'd share that one.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rory, for your time. I think we're at the top of our hour. And yeah,
It's been a huge pleasure.
incredible.
Absolute
Yeah,
pleasure.
incredible honor speaking with you. You're a hero of mine.
Likewise.
I've read everything that you've written. So, incredible honor, absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for this.
I'll try and make it out to Mumbai next year in 2025. That's my aim. So it'll be wonderful to meet up. Really fantastic.
Definitely, definitely. I'll stay in touch on the email.
The most exciting thing, okay, in my lifetime potentially, is that India gets plugged into the world innovation economy fully.
Right.
Because it's 1.6 billion people, but if you plug in that many, if you look at, for example, your institutes of technology, my friend Guru Madhavan says that
Okay.
people who are turned down from the IIT go to MIT as a fallback. Okay,
Yeah.
once that fully really kind of plugs in, and by the way, I think that Zoom is really, really important. I think one of the things that annoys me about our business at the moment, we're talking about AI endlessly. AI is quite important, and it's very interesting and could be monumentally important. I'm not disputing that. But actually, what we already have, which is video conferencing, is much, much more important economically in terms of the spread of ideas and the spread, and actually also the spread of opportunity. In other words, there is now a space in between the phone call, the text message, and the WhatsApp, and the face-to-face meeting. Okay. And there was this yawning gulf between very, very shallow forms of kind of asynchronous communication. Then you had kind of this phone call thing, a little bit anomalously. Okay. Then you had this yawning gap between the phone call and actually getting on a plane or, meeting 5 people around a table. And the fact that we have the opportunity for conversations like this, regardless of place, is really, really important. And yet nobody's talking about it. Economically, it should be a couple of percent on world GDP.
Absolutely.
The Zoom boom. Yeah.
Yeah. To me, it seems like the great unlock with the internet.
Yeah, completely agree. And actually, by the way, I think YouTube is immensely important because I think it's reached a level of information now. I think YouTube went through a kind of escape velocity where it was highly entertaining. It's always been highly interesting, but it's now reached a level of comprehensiveness where it's like Wikipedia with video. If I want to know about, if I want to know about an obscure aspect of, say, Indian history or British history, someone's made a film about it. Now, that wasn't true 8 years ago. You could search, but you probably wouldn't find. And one of the things, I don't understand why governments haven't mentioned this, we should actually teach videography and filmmaking in schools because it's now literacy. It's a form of literacy, being able to make a film. And I don't know why we haven't updated the curriculum to add another R. Don't know what that is. Okay, but you know, but to reading, writing, arithmetic, etc., you now need to add, I think, filmmaking as a form of literacy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute
Yeah,
delight.
yeah.
Thanks ever so much.
Same here.
And I hope to
Thank you
see you
so much.
next year in
Definitely,
person.
definitely,
Even better.
definitely.
Thanks ever so much. Oh, I
Thank
will
you.
send you the recording, by the way. I will now
Yeah,
stop the
perfect.
recording.